Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be giving this presentation. This is the third time that I've given this presentation. Each time it's the same presentation but different. The title of this presentation is Abandonment and Dismemberment, Something Torn and New. Something Torn and New. And I wanted to begin this presentation with an excerpt from one of my favorite songs, it's out right now, by a brother named J. Cole. You might know him. And J. Cole is an interesting figure, very interesting background. North Carolina, came via Germany, went to school at St. John's University, got his bachelor's degree in communications. There's also the president of the Pan-African Student Association there at St. John's. It was very, very clear that this brother has his consciousness and awareness that is very refreshing on the hip-hop system. So follow his work very closely. But in any event, this beautiful song that is out right now with this absolutely beautiful hook sung by TLC, T-Vibes and Chillin'. On my way, on my way, on my way now. On my way, on my way, on my way now. You're the one that was trying to keep me waiting now. Like the sun, you know I found my way back around. Wonderful, wonderful book. But it's interesting when you look at this song, you're the one that was trying to keep me way down. You, J. Cole frames this as an impersonal, second person singular pronoun. That means that it's undefined. So J. Cole is referring to anything. There could be an array of things that he's referring to. And indeed, that's the sense. That's exactly the sense that he wants us to get from this song. So, on one level, there are these external forces, these external social forces, whether they be visible or invisible, that cajole you as an individual to change or alter who you are to fit the expectations of what someone else wants you to be. That's on a personal level, and for sure, J. Cole has that sense when he created this song. But when you look at that last verse of this song, it's clear that J. Cole has something bigger in mind also. So he's just not referring to the individual and their fight against these social forces. He's referring to something much larger. He begins to bridge that analysis from the individual level to a much broader societal level. Indeed, you can see here in that song when he says, look at the nation, that's a crooked smile, braces couldn't be any straighter. Seem like half the race is either on probation or injured. Wonder why we inhale, cause we inhale already. That's a different type of critique. And J. Cole is begging the question there that those social forces that are attempting to keep us down operate more than just on the individual level. Whether or not you recognize them as real, they operate on the societal level, they operate on the government level, they operate on the cultural level. The key is to be aware of that. To be aware of that, but also to resist it. And the reason why I chose this song to start, because that hook explains the essence of the message that I want to give to you today. What is the crooked in relationship to this idea of the dismemberment of Africa. This dismemberment of Africa, the African continent. We can nominally say it takes place with the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. King Leopold II in Belgium, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, calling together numerous European leaders to come together in Germany to carve up the African continent. And what King Leopold II called this magnificent piece of African cake. To carve it up for their economic and political interests. That system, those social forces, that thing that's trying to keep African people way down, that thing that's called imperialism, that's called colonialism, that thing that African people deal with and its resulting legacy on the continent. Very, very difficult to overcome. That's one aspect of this dismemberment. But there is another aspect of this dismemberment also that takes place in relationship to not just the continent of Africa, but the resulting African diaspora that emerges as a result of the slave trade. And we can see as a result, if you look at this map, as a result of all of those Africans taken, primarily the larger circles here represent where more Africans were taken. That larger circle represents West Central Africa, and African people were taken primarily from all over the West African and West Central African coast. That diaspora, that rupture post the 15th century, that dispersion of African people into the New World, in all parts, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in South America, the result of that all over has been a rupture that has to be explained by scholars. How do we explain that rupture? And it's very interesting because when we talk about what happens in the diaspora, the normative standard narratives that we get in writing in history books downplay the power of the African presence. Even though between 1492 and 1776, even though 5 out of every 6 people that were in the New World were Africans, even though as late as 1820, 3 times as many African people were in the New World as Europeans. Those demographics statistics suggest something very powerful. There is an African presence on this landscape in the Americas. And that African presence must be understood, it must be examined in its economic, in its political, in its social, cultural activity and dimensions in order to fully understand what happened to African people once they were dispersed in the New World. And so, this Kenyan scholar, Ngugi Thiong'o, says that this dismemberment that happens with the continent of Africa and the diaspora, it looks a little bit different in both places. On the continent of Africa, the issue is different because the notion of memory, the notion of the expressive culture, the societal culture, the reflective culture, the philosophy, the knowledge, the wisdom, all of that surrounds African people on the continent. But yet, Thiong'o asked the question, did the death intended for one's means of memory actually materialize? He's implying that on the African continent, this whole cultural matrix is there. But yet, because of colonialism, because of imperialism, African people on the continent have been cajoled to, in some sense, look at themselves through the eyes of another. especially in the educational process. So although the memory is there, although the cultural products surround them, it becomes very, very difficult to challenge them. And so on the African continent, the UNGO focuses on Western Christianity and Western education as these processes that attempt to socialize African people. Underneath those ideas become Western culture. And so this process is attempting to socialize African people away from themselves in religion. All of the aspects of African culture, drumming, dancing, dress, names, rites of passage, etc. The UNGO says that those things are attempted to be suppressed. Those things that make African people who they are, those things that surround them, those things are not allowed to be brought into the educational system. They're suppressed. They're treated as curiosities, as entertainment, as something that is inferior, something that is not really what makes one human. Religion the same way. African people bring their own spiritual systems, their own way of knowing and doing things. And these things are suppressed in that context. So Bianco is saying that that's the challenge for memory for African people on the continent, attempting to overcome that legacy of imperialism and colonialism. But the challenge in the diaspora is somewhat a little different because the assault on the historical and cultural memory was much more sophisticated and elaborate. And so African people in these spaces have to fight harder to maintain their humanity, to maintain their social structures, to maintain their cultures, their values, their beliefs. And this system, although this rupture was there, African ethnicities blended together, interacted with one another, and transformed their identities in this kind of composite African humanity in the New World that must be understood on its own terms in all of its complexity. So it begs the question of how do we understand this rupture? How do we explain this rupture of African people in the diaspora? When African people are forced to come here in the United States, and the Caribbean, and South America, did that rupture, did the slave trade mean that African people lost everything in that transition? This whole narrative of loss, this whole narrative of emptiness, that African people in this transition lost their names, lost their culture, lost their social structures, lost their family structures, lost their systems of governance, lost their ways of knowing. And so if you've lost everything, that means that you're culturally empty. And if you're culturally empty, what you fill yourself up with is whatever you think, whatever you're getting from that dominant culture. So one theory, one conservative theory of how to explain this is there are some scholars who say that this rupture was so overwhelming to African humanity, that the slaveholders and the plantation system was so overwhelming to African humanity, that it's easy to say that African people lost everything. And essentially, what they're trying to make of themselves in the New World is the best that they can do vis-a-vis this dominant white system of governance. Black skin, white mask. Then there's another way to explain this rupture that takes place in the diaspora. These historical narratives of newness that assemble and combine African and European traditions, and they often give primacy to the European side of the equation, these notions of hybridity. So this way says that, yes, there is some African flavor. It mixes with European traditions and customs and systems of governance. But primarily, what African people make of themselves post that rupture is essentially what they do over here after that rupture. So there's this idea of newness, even though it's with a little bit of African flavor, that idea is still a newness. So it's more progressive than the notion of emptiness or complete loss. But it still says that that relationship, that connection with Africa is tenuous, is ambiguous, is very weak. And then there is kind of the third quadrant perspective. And this is the perspective that historical narratives of African continuity and collective synthesis and transformation interface with particular social traditions is wherever African people find themselves in the New World. And how you explain these ideas of survival through resistance. What African people carry with them. This notion, this is the perspective that suggests that African people did not lose everything. In fact, they maintained fundamental aspects of who they were in this transition. And the point is that to come up with and to create explanatory models that allow us to see that reality more clearly. Because if we take the position that 5 out of every 6 Africans were in the world between 1492 and 1776. It is obvious, it's the same, that all of those African people brought with them their worldviews, their languages, their culture, their history, their memories. And despite the oppression, despite white supremacy, despite the plantation system, those systems continue to survive and even thrive in the New World. But in order to see that, we have to look at the explanatory models. We have to be able to be aware of that. So this third perspective represents what I think and what many scholars think is the best way to explain what is happening to African people in this diaspora. And one example of this is a text by a brother named Michael Gomez, who teaches at NYU, New York University, has a book called Exchanging Our Country Homes. But this book is important in the sense that Gomez is doing something different that you see in typical kind of African American history textbooks. And these typical African American history textbooks will give us a template when they discuss ancient Africa. They'll give us a template and talk about Ghana and all these song guys, and they'll come over here to the United States. What Gomez is doing is he's saying that there is a very sophisticated transition of African ethnicities from various parts of the West African and West Central African coast that make their way to the United States. And so what he's doing is focusing on and systematically studying those ethnicities and then showing how those ethnicities and their worldviews and their culture play out on the American landscape in detail. And then he's showing us through that text of how these African ethnicities in the cauldron of white supremacy in North America, how these different African ethnicities interact amongst themselves, how they interact with the social order, but how they negotiate different aspects of their African identities that they bring with them from these specific places on the African continent, and how they begin to blend those things together to create what we come to know as a composite African American community. And he deals with that all the way up until 1830. And he's saying very descriptively, when you look at everything that African people have done in this country, that it is very clear that when you look at the evidence, that these African cultures were not without in this transition. And that we need new methodological approaches that allow us to see that reality. And so, how do we get to this, the Africanness of something new? It begs us to go beyond this idea of culture. We have to write one's culture is more than the material artifacts and exact replications of traditional practices. It is a learned set of behaviors, beliefs, values, and worldview that express a particular humanity and group identity. We have to use this, when we look at this culture, we have to use this orientation to completely rewrite the history of the Americas that includes the tremendous and powerful and deep impact of the African presence and the African economic, political, and social cultural activity that takes place here, and to chart systematically how that African presence shaped not only the Americas, but shaped the modern world. So this narrative of the diaspora doesn't just become a narrative of what Europeans have done to African people. This becomes, we flip the script and we begin to chart systematically what African people have done in these spaces to impact that world, to shape that culture in their own interests. So that's a sense of agency that is often lost in many of the common historical narratives that we read. So in order to do this, what must we look at on a methodological level? We can look at everything. Everything becomes a text for us to explore African humanity. The art, the music, the literature, the dress, the architecture, the tools, the food, the language, the philosophy, the knowledge, the religion, the family patterns, the political culture, the rituals, all of those things become texts that we can look at and descriptively show, explain, describe the African presence and how it has continued in the Americas. We can see this obviously in big ways, like the creation of these maroon societies. African people fleeing from the plantations, fleeing from the gaze of the slave master to recreate or to create their African humanity in self-governing spaces, whether it's in Brazil, with the Palmares community in the 17th century, whether it's in Jamaica, or whether it's even in the United States. We're all over the South. Herbert Atwater in his book talks about the idea that there were over at least 50 maroon communities documented in the United States. So this history, this culture, what African people do in the New World is very sophisticated. That's on one level, that's the most obvious level. But the thing that's not so obvious to see is these ways of knowing. These ways of knowing. What does J. Cole say in the song? Because what's real is something that the eyes can't see, hands can't touch. We're going to check the last part. but everybody's checking the last part. And that other people can't be. And that's you. But the key is, it's those things, what are those invisible things that you can't see, that you can't touch? The ways of knowing. These things that are very deep in the humanity of African people that still manifest themselves in very complex ways in what they create. Abandonment, with the bringing of the Orisha, with the bringing of Yoruba divinities, gods, from West Africa, from Nigeria, from Beatty. This is alive. This is a living African cultural tradition and is very powerful. It is basically the national religion of Brazil. Today, Haiti, New Orleans, the Bodum, the spirits of the Pan and the Epe, Cuba, Santeria, even in the United States, with what we call re-Africanized Christianity. That is the symbol of the cross. Many scholars have made this analogy. The symbol of the cross, the Christian cross, resembles the Congo cosmos. This is in Robert Farris Thompson's Flash of the Spirit. These rituals that African Americans engage in: water baptism, funerary rites, possession, spirit possession, speaking in tongues, etc. Think of Christianity as a container. But the most important part is, what is that container filled up with? That's a label. Look underneath the label and look and see what are the cultural ideas and practices that take place underneath that label. And there you will find the continuation and perpetuation of African cultural humanity. So Robert Farris Thompson spends a lot of time on this Congo cosmogram. In his book, The Flash of the Spirit, he spends a lot of time, a whole chapter, on essentially the Congo from West Central Africa. What they brought themselves, this idea of J. Cole, gets to it in this song. Like the sun, I know you know, I'll find my way back around. Well, that sun, what Robert Farris Thompson does is to say that that sun links to African cosmology. That sun, the 4 moments of the sun, is this Congo cosmogram. And the reason why Robert Farris Thompson gives this Congo cosmogram is because he is saying that these people from West Central Africa, from the Congo, brought this orientation here with them. And this orientation has influenced fundamental aspects of who we are. It gets played out in the music, talks about its influence on jazz and the creation of jazz, and a whole host of other cultural elements that are very important. But what does this 4 moments of the sun communicate from their worldview, this cross, from their worldview? From their worldview in the Flash of the Spirit, it says in Congo, thought of the earth as a mountain over a body of water, which is the land of the dead called Imperialism, and the top is called Toto. In Imperialism, the sun rises and sets just as it does in the land of the living. The water is both a passage and a great barrier. The world in Congo thought is like 2 mountains of poles at their bases and separated by the ocean called Kalunga. At the rising and setting of the sun, the living and the dead exchange day and night. The setting of the sun signifies man's death and his rising, his rebirth, or the continuity of his life. But Congo believe and hold it true that man's life has no end, that it constitutes a cycle, and death is merely a transition in the process of change. Like the sun, you know I'll find my way back. That's not just a message of kind of personal self-empowerment over the challenges, the barriers and obstacles that you face as an individual in the social order. That line something very deep in African cosmology, in African humanity, because the sun becomes linked. It's symbolic of this natural phenomenon. It is symbolic of when the sun rises on the eastern horizon in the morning, that moment that the sun rises, that moment is pregnant with the possibilities of hope, the possibilities of overcoming everything, that light that's on the horizon. That's a very, very powerful spiritual moment in African cosmologies. But the whole notion is that this isn't linear time. You're not moving away from your ancestors. Your ancestors in linear time are situated back there, and then you're moving in a linear way here, away from them. It's like the sun. Everything goes round. Everything is connected. You're not moving away from your ancestors, you're moving toward them in African cosmology. And everything connected finds its way back around. And so we can see how this meaning is made in many, many examples. The language, how Black people talk all over the New World. So there's a lot of sophisticated studies done on this. We can see it in the literature, the stories that are transferred from various African cultures into the New World, the Anansi stories from Akan, the Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, etc. We can see it in how African people dance. We can see it in music, all of these features. Of course, we can see it in all of those cultural meaning-making practices. But the thing is, folks, what's this crooked smile of Africa and its diaspora? The message of J. Cole, the message of that song, the very deep message of that song, is that regardless of what those societal forces are, those barriers are that are external to you, don't let those forces shape who you are or who you want to be as a person. Don't fall prey to those expectations, to resist those things that are trying to oppress you, to resist those things that are trying to, in some sense, suppress your humanity. J. Cole says, no need to fix what God put his paintbrush on. No need to fix it. That line, no need to fix what God has put his paintbrush on. That line says everything about the book that you're going to be reading in this course. The Freshman Seminar of Africa. That line by J. Cole, that's the whole thesis of this book. Because what Wole Soyinka does in this book of Africa, he begs a question. He says, in what forms did that continent, the African continent, express its spirituality before the advent of Islam and Christianity? The answer is easy as grasped in the negative, and the answer is not in any violent or conscriptive form. Unlike in other parts of the globe, religion on the continent has always been a process of relating to phenomena that surround man, including unseen forces, primarily in a personal way, but collectively also in rites and notation, celebration, and consolidation of community. This is a very important point, because the idea is that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism and spiritual systems have their place in the modern world. But Wole Soyinka is asking another question. He's saying that like those systems, African spiritual systems also in the modern world. That these systems are still living, that these systems have blended with Christianity and Islam in very complex ways on the continent. But in addition to that, they have also maintained the power and the efficacy of themselves. And so the point is, one of the many points is that when Christianity comes, gives these examples. When Christianity comes to Africa, in order to try to translate the Bible into African culture, you have to attempt to translate idioms and ideas and notions that may not exist in that culture. So there were attempts by Christian missionaries to translate ideas of Satan and the devil that did not exist in these systems. And so they would go to Europe and they would say, what's your idea of a devil, of a Satan, in your own culture? So that we can impose that idea on your culture, so that we can just render that whole spiritual system as from Satan, from the devil, pagan, something to move away from, something to never take part in, something that is unnatural to you as a human being. So they go into the spiritual system and they find a divinity at Shua in Europe. And they say that's the devil. But from Yoruba cosmology, that's not the devil at all. Well, Soyinka says that that is the divinity that represents indeterminacy of life, roles, the roles that you choose as an individual. Knowledge is very flexible. There are many, it represents the complexity of life and the human condition. So the idea of translating these idioms and then using those things to make negative value judgments on these systems, that complexity that happens, that forces African people, that controls African people to not want to be who they are. And so Soyinka is asking the question of what did African spiritual systems look like before the advent of Christianity and Islam? So the real question that he is saying is that African people have a humanity, and their humanity does not necessarily have to be expressed by converting to Christianity or Islam. And he goes on to say that African spiritual systems at their very foundation have a lot to teach the world. If the world would only listen. What do they have to teach the world? Soyinka says that first, African spiritual systems, they don't care what you believe, they don't care about your faith. They don't care what any human being believes. Those aren't the things that matter in the human condition. The things that matter are your behavior, your character, how you create community in the context of the whole, how you create who you are as a person in relationship to everything that surrounds you. He says that's what African people are attempting to do. And he goes on to say that there is a great deal of tolerance, that this Orisha presence is all over the New World. He uses this as kind of a template. It's all over the New World. But these spiritual systems provide guidance, not dictates, as he says. And they exude the spirit of tolerance, the spirit of humanity, the spirit of collectivity, this notion of non-value judgments on everyone's culture and beliefs. And he says, despite this assault on African humanity, despite this assault on the continent with imperialism, with colonialism, despite this assault on the diaspora, despite the slave trade, despite white supremacy, racism, the plantation system, oppression, discrimination, despite all of that African people have experienced, it still survives to teach the world, even without property taxes. So after all of that, like the sun, African people find their way back around. So there is nothing that can hold African people back. There is nothing that can hold African people back. The only thing that can hold African people back is the non-belief in themselves. The non-belief in who we are. And the inability of us to use our historical memories, to use our culture, to use our humanity, to engage and to navigate the modern world as human beings, like every other human culture does. I thank you very much.